The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix has a weight to it. It settles somewhere behind the sternum, not quite pain, not quite pressure, just a presence that's always there when everything else goes quiet. Stewart Mallory had been carrying that weight for 3 years, and he had gotten so used to it that he sometimes forgot it wasn't just part of who he was now. He stood at the kitchen sink at 6:15 in the morning, rinsing a cereal bowl that his daughter had left on the counter instead of putting in the dishwasher. And he did not say anything about it because she was 9 and she was still learning, and because some fights weren't worth having before the school bus came. He could hear her upstairs, the particular thump and shuffle of a child who was technically awake but not yet in possession of all her faculties. He dried his hands on a dish towel that had a faded picture of a lighthouse on it. His wife had bought it at a gift shop in Maine the summer before she died. He used it every morning. He didn't know if that was a healthy thing or not, and he had decided some time ago to stop asking himself the question. His name was Stewart Mallory. He was 41 years old. He had been a diesel mechanic for 19 years, the last 11 at Corrigan Industrial, a mid-size equipment maintenance company that serviced fleets of construction machinery across the southeastern region. He was, by any honest measure, very good at his job. The kind of good that other mechanics came to with the problems they couldn't solve. The kind of good that a machine would run for years after Stewart touched it when it had been dying before. He held 2 certifications that most people at his level didn't bother getting, had taken every training course the company offered and 3 that they didn't, on his own time and with his own money. None of that had gotten him the shop supervisor position when it came open the previous spring. That had gone to a man named Brendan Marsh, who had a business administration degree from a state school and 8 months of experience in the industry. Brendan was 32 and had a firm handshake and said things like synergizing the workflow in meetings, and the regional manager, a man named Dwight Falk, thought he showed real leadership potential. Stewart had been passed over twice before for smaller things, and both times he had told himself it didn't matter. This time he had not been able to make himself believe it. His daughter's name was Lily, not the Lily in the list of names he'd been careful to avoid, just a coincidence of syllables. The name his wife had chosen before she was born, the name that had been waiting for her. She came downstairs at 6:22 with her backpack half-zipped and one sock on and the other in her hand, and she looked at him with her mother's eyes, which were brown and serious, and said she couldn't find her library book. They found it under the couch. He drove her to the bus stop and watched the bus take her, and then he sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running and thought about the interview. He had applied to Kellerman and Voss Industrial Services 3 weeks ago, responding to a listing for a senior fleet maintenance technician. The position paid 22% more than his current salary, offered better benefits, and, according to the listing, came with a clear path toward a supervisory role for candidates who demonstrated the right combination of technical expertise and professional judgment. That last phrase had been the one that made him apply. He had been demonstrating technical expertise and professional judgment for 11 years without anyone attaching a career path to it. He figured he might as well try somewhere that was at least pretending the path existed. The interview was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning. He was not a man who did things like go out the night before an important interview. He was the kind of man who laid out his clothes in advance and reviewed his notes and went to bed at a reasonable hour. But his neighbor, an older woman named Frances, who sometimes watched Lily when he needed an evening, had offered without being asked, and his friend Doug had called and said he was driving through town and did Stewart want to grab one drink at Callaway's, just to catch up, and Stewart had said yes, because Doug lived in Knoxville now, and they saw each other maybe twice a year, and because, if he was being honest with himself, sitting alone in the house, thinking about the interview, was not doing him any particular good. Calloway's was the kind of bar that had been there so long it had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. Dark wood, older booths, a jukebox that still worked if you knew which button to hold down. Stewart and Doug had been going there since they were in their late 20s, back when they'd worked at the same shop and lived in the same apartment complex and thought they had more time than they did for everything. Doug's drive had run long. He texted from somewhere on I-20 to say he'd be another 40 minutes. Stewart ordered a beer he didn't particularly need and sat at the bar and watched the room with the particular quietness of a person who is comfortable in his own silence. The couple in the booth by the far window had been there when he arrived. He noticed them the way he noticed everything, not intrusively, just with the mild, habitual attention of someone who worked with machinery and had learned to observe before touching. The woman was in her mid to late 30s, professionally dressed in the way that suggested she had come from something rather than going to something. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, a glass of wine she was barely drinking. The man across from her was older, somewhere in his late 50s, with the particular posture of someone accustomed to being listened to. He was talking. She was not, or was not talking much. Her posture had changed in the time Stewart had been watching, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would probably notice, but her shoulders had come in slightly, and she had moved her wine glass to the far edge of the table, which was the kind of thing people did when they wanted to create a small boundary between themselves and the situation they were in. Stewart looked back at his beer. He was not a man who inserted himself into other people's business. He had learned, over the course of his life, that most situations had less to do with him than they appeared to from the outside, and that most problems people had were better solved by the people who had them. He believed in minding his own affairs. He had raised his daughter to mind her own affairs too, up to the point where minding your own affairs became a way of looking away from something you shouldn't look away from. He glanced back at the booth. The man had leaned forward. The woman had leaned back. There was something in the dynamic that was no longer ambiguous, a quality of unease that had moved past the category of social discomfort into something else. The woman's hand was on the edge of the table in a way that looked like she was thinking about getting up. Stewart picked up his beer and his phone and walked across the room to the booth. He did not do it in a dramatic way. He did not raise his voice or square his shoulders or make himself large. He simply walked over and sat down on the edge of the bench next to the woman, as if he'd been expected, and looked at the man across the table with a calm that he had not manufactured for the occasion. It was just the way he looked when he was working through something that required steadiness. "Sorry I'm late," he said to no one in particular, and then, to the man, "I don't think we've met." The man looked at him. His name, Stewart would learn much later, was Richard Tolliver, and he had the look of someone who was not accustomed to being interrupted. "I don't think this concerns you," he said. "Probably not," Stewart agreed. He said it in the tone of a man acknowledging a reasonable point. Then he looked at the woman and said, quietly, "You want to go?" She looked at him for a moment. There was something calculating in the look, not suspicious of him, exactly, but precise. She was figuring him out quickly, the way people do when they have to make a fast decision about whether to trust a stranger. "Yes," she said. They walked out together. He held the door. On the sidewalk outside, she stopped and turned and looked at him in the particular way of someone who has just been handed an unexpected exit from a situation and is still slightly recalibrating. "Thank you," she said. "It's fine," he said. "You didn't have to do that. I know." She looked at him for another moment. "Are you actually meeting someone in there?" "Eventually," he said. "My friend Doug. He's running late." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm sorry I pulled you away from your evening." "You didn't," he said. "I was just sitting." She asked if she could wait with him for a few minutes until she could get an Uber, and he said of course. They stood in front of the bar, and he asked if she was all right, and she said she was. It had been a work dinner that had gone in an unwanted direction, nothing she hadn't dealt with before, which was its own quietly dispiriting thing to say. She didn't tell him her name, and he didn't ask. He called her Uber when the app showed it was 2 minutes away and told her the make and color of the car. She thanked him again before she got in. He watched the car pull out, and then he went back inside. Doug showed up 20 minutes later, and they talked about football, and Doug's new job, and Doug's youngest kid who had just started walking, and Stewart drove home by 10:30 and laid out his clothes for the morning and went to bed. He did not think about the woman at Calloway's again that night. He was not the kind of man who assigned too much significance to small kindnesses. He had done a reasonable thing in a situation that called for it. That was all. The offices of Kellerman and Voss Industrial Services were on the 4th floor of a glass building in a business park just off the interstate. The kind of place that had a fountain in the lobby that nobody looked at and a receptionist who was very efficient and called him Mr. Mallory when he gave his name and told him someone would be with him shortly. He sat in the waiting area with his folder of certifications and references on his knee and his hands still in his lap. He was not nervous in the way that some people were nervous before interviews, the visible trembling kind. He was nervous in a quieter way, the kind that came from caring about the outcome without being able to control it. He had done everything in his power to prepare. The rest was not up to him. A door opened. A woman in a dark blazer came into the waiting area and stopped when she saw him, and he looked up, and they stayed that way for a moment, just a fraction longer than the usual pause before an interview began. He recognized her at the same moment she recognized him. She recovered first, or perhaps they recovered at the same time. He wasn't entirely sure looking back on it later. What he was sure of was that neither of them said anything about the night before. She extended her hand and said, "Mr. Mallory, I'm Allison Court, VP of Operations. Thanks for coming in today." Her voice was professional and level, giving nothing away that wasn't meant to be given. He shook her hand and said it was good to meet her. He meant it. He followed her down a short hallway and into a conference room where 2 other people were already seated. A man about her age named James Whitfield, who ran Fleet Logistics, and an older woman named Barbara Hearn from HR, who had a legal pad and a pen and the organized, watchful demeanor of someone who has interviewed a great many people and still took it seriously. They went through his resume. They asked about his certifications, about specific repairs he had managed, about situations in which he had to work under deadline or with limited resources. He answered carefully and honestly, in the way he always tried to do things, without embellishment and without false modesty. He knew what he had done. He did not need to make it bigger than it was, and he was not going to make it smaller. 20 minutes in, Allison Court turned her legal pad slightly toward her and asked him the question he had not expected. "Tell me about a time when you saw something that was wrong, not wrong like a mechanical error, but wrong in the human sense, in a situation where it wasn't technically your place to step in. What did you do?" The room was quiet. James Whitfield was watching him. Barbara Hearn had her pen ready. Stewart considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things, without rushing. He thought about his years at Corrigan Industrial. He thought about things he had spoken up about and things he hadn't. He thought about his former coworker Dave, who had covered for a bad repair on a forklift because he hadn't wanted to redo the job, and Stewart had flagged it quietly to the shop manager without making a scene, and the forklift had been taken out of service and inspected before anyone was hurt. He thought about a younger mechanic named Travis who had been blamed for a problem he hadn't caused, and how Stewart had gone to HR with the actual timeline. None of those stories were dramatic. They were just choices made in ordinary moments. He told the story about the forklift. He told it plainly, without making himself the center of it. When he was done, Allison Court made a note. She looked up and said, "What made you decide to say something rather than stay quiet?" He thought about it. "Because I could see where it was going," he said, "and the fact that it wasn't my formal responsibility didn't change what I knew." She nodded. Not in a way that telegraphed approval exactly, but in the way of someone who had been listening carefully and had heard what she was listening for. There were more questions after that, standard ones. He answered them. The interview lasted another 35 minutes and ended with Barbara Hearn explaining the timeline for a decision, 2 weeks, and letting him know he would hear either way. He thanked them. He shook hands around the table. At the door, Allison Court walked him out, a small courtesy she hadn't extended at the start, or perhaps he just hadn't noticed. In the hallway outside the conference room, in the brief corridor before the waiting area, she paused. "Mr. Mallory," she said. He turned. She held his gaze for a moment. Her voice was careful and even, the professional register held firmly in place. "I appreciate how you conducted yourself today." He understood that she was not only talking about the interview. "Thank you for your time," he said, and then, because it seemed right to acknowledge it without making anything of it, "I hope your evening got better." She looked at him for just a moment longer. "It did," she said. He nodded once and walked to the elevator. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15. She had a permission slip for a field trip to a nature center, which needed to be signed and returned by Friday. And she had gotten a 91 on her spelling test, which she was middlingly satisfied with because she had been hoping for higher, but had missed the word adjacent, which she felt was unfair because she had never seen that word used in real life. He told her adjacent came up more than she might think. She looked skeptical. He signed the permission slip at the kitchen table while she had a snack, and he thought about the interview, and about the question Allison Court had asked him, and about the fact that he had answered it completely honestly, without realizing until he was halfway through the answer that he was, in some sense, describing the night before, describing the specific calculation of seeing something wrong in a moment, where he could have stayed in his seat and finished his beer, and no one would have thought less of him for it. He had not done it because he thought it would pay off. He had not done it because he wanted anything from it. He had done it because the woman's shoulders had come in and she had moved her glass, and he had seen where it was going, and the fact that it wasn't his formal responsibility had not changed what he knew. He thought about Brendan Marsh, sitting in the supervisor's office at Corrigan Industrial right now, synergizing the workflow, drawing a salary Stewart had earned by any measure that actually mattered. He thought about it, and then he folded the permission slip and put it in Lily's backpack for Friday, and he got up and started making dinner. There was a particular moment, around 7 in the evening, when Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table, and the radio was on low, and the light through the back window was going gold and flat the way it did in October, when the house felt, briefly, like enough. Not healed, not fixed, not what it used to be, just enough. He had learned, slowly and without any great epiphany, that enough was worth holding on to. He washed the dishes while she finished her homework. He checked her work. He read to her for 20 minutes from a book about a girl who discovers a door in her grandmother's garden, which he was privately enjoying more than he expected to. He turned off her light at 8:30. He sat in the living room in the chair by the window, the chair he'd had since before Lily was born, with a glass of water and no television, and the quiet of the house around him. He was still a little tired. That weight behind the sternum was still there, as it always was. But there was something else there, too. Something that hadn't been there that morning. Not hope, exactly, because hope felt too large and too contingent for a man who had learned to be careful with contingent things. Something smaller. The sense of having done the day correctly, of having made the choices he would make again if he had to make them over. That was worth something. He knew it was worth something, even when it didn't feel like enough. The call came 9 days later, not at the end of the 2-week window, but in the middle of it, which he had learned was a moderately good sign. It was Barbara Hearn from HR, and she asked if he had a few minutes, and he stepped away from the machine he was working on, and said that he did. They were pleased to offer him the position, she said. The start date would be the 2nd week of November, if that worked for him. The salary was what had been listed, with a standard benefits package that she would send over in writing. There was a performance review at 6 months, and if things went well, she said this in the careful, optimistic tone of someone who was fairly sure things would go well. There would be a conversation about the supervisory track at that point. He said that worked for him. He said thank you. He hung up and stood in the parking lot of Corrigan Industrial for a moment with the phone still in his hand. The sky was the particular pale blue of a cloudless October morning, and there was a smell of diesel and dry grass, and he could hear the machinery inside the shop, the sounds he had been hearing for 11 years, the sounds he knew the way some people know music. He was going to miss some of it. He was also, he knew, not going to miss all of it. He thought about calling Doug, but Doug was probably in a meeting. He thought about telling Francis next door, but that felt like something to do in person. He thought about Lily, who was in school and who would not fully understand what the news meant until later, when the numbers translated into something concrete like new shoes without him checking the price twice. Or the camping trip he had been quietly shelving for 2 years. He put the phone in his pocket and went back inside. He had one more machine to finish before the end of his shift. It was a crawler loader with a fuel injection problem that 2 other mechanics had looked at before him and concluded needed a full pump replacement. He had suspected since yesterday morning that it was a simpler issue, a blocked return line, and he had spent the last 2 days quietly working through his suspicion with the methodical care that had always been his way. He was right. It was the return line. He fixed it. He ran the machine through a full diagnostic cycle and watched the numbers come back clean. He wrote up his notes in the logbook with the specific detail that a good repair record required, the kind of detail that helped the next person who worked on the machine. Whoever they were, wherever they were working. He had always done it that way, not because anyone required it, because the information mattered and mattering was reason enough. He clocked out at 5:15. He drove to Lily's aftercare. She came out with her backpack and her jacket half off one shoulder, the way she always wore it, and she saw his face. Something in the particular quality of his stillness, maybe, or in the way he was standing, and she said, "What happened?" "Good news," he said. She studied him with those brown, serious eyes that were her mother's. "Are you sure it's good?" "Pretty sure," he said. She thought about this for a moment with the particular philosophical gravity that 9-year-olds could sometimes bring to bear on a situation. "Okay," she said. "Tell me in the car." He told her in the car. She listened carefully and asked 2 questions: whether they would have to move, and whether he would still be able to pick her up from school. The answer to both was no, they wouldn't have to move, and yes, he would still be there. "Okay," she said again. And then after a moment, "Can we get pizza?" They got pizza. He watched her eat with the appetite of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious about hunger, and he thought about the last 3 years, about the weight he had been carrying, and the ways he had learned to carry it, about the choices he had made in small moments that had not felt significant and that had, collectively, become the shape of the person he was now. He thought about a woman moving her wine glass to the far edge of a table. He thought about a question asked across a conference table and the honest answer he had given without knowing it had already been answered. He did not believe, exactly, that the universe kept accounts. He had seen too much in his life to be comfortable with that kind of clean arithmetic. Good people lost things they should not have lost. Bad people kept things they should not have kept. He knew that. He had learned it at 38, in a hospital room, in a way he had not chosen and would not have chosen. But he also believed, and this belief had survived everything, which meant it was not naive, which meant it was worth believing, that the choices you made in the small moments were not wasted, not because they were always rewarded, because they were who you were when no one was watching, because they added up, over time, to something you could recognize as yourself, because Lily was watching, even when he thought she wasn't, and what she was going to know about how to move through the world she was going to learn from watching him. He paid for the pizza. He left a reasonable tip, the same percentage he always left, and he made sure she saw him do it. On the way home, she asked what the new job would be like. He told her, more complicated machines, more responsibility, a chance, eventually, to be in charge of a team. Do you want to be in charge of a team, she asked. He thought about it honestly. Yes, he said. I think I'd be good at it. She seemed to accept this. She looked out the window at the streetlights coming on in the October evening, and after a moment she said, I think so too. He drove home. The weight behind his sternum was still there. It had not disappeared. He did not think it was going to disappear. But it was lighter than it had been that morning, lighter than it had been in some time, and that was the whole story. And it was, he understood, enough.